Dad. She looks exactly like me. Mafia boss discovers his daughter has a twin. What would you do if you looked across a crowded, opulent room and saw your exact reflection, staring back at you not in a mirror, but in the face of a complete stranger? For Silvia Orlando, the privileged daughter of the city's most feared mafia boss, this impossible encounter unravels a decades-old web of blood, betrayal, and dark family secrets. When her ruthless father investigates the mysterious look-alike, the terrifying truth he uncovers threatens to destroy his empire. Welcome to a tale of power, identity, and ultimate moral redemption. The grand ballroom of the Belvedere Hotel was a symphony of wealth and whispered secrets. Chandeliers made of imported Bohemian crystal cast a fractured golden light over Chicago's elite. Silvia Orlando moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of royalty. Clad in a custom crimson silk gown that swept the marble floor, she was the untouchable princess of the Orlando crime family. Officially, her father, Filippo Orlando, was a real estate mogul and philanthropist. Unofficially, he held the city's underworld in a grip of iron and blood. Silvia despised these galas. They were a parade of sycophants, hoping to curry favor with her father. She politely excused herself from a tedious conversation with a local alderman, desperate for a moment of quiet. As she turned the corner toward the secluded terrace, the heavy mahogany doors to the catering kitchen swung open. A young waitress, laden with a towering tray of champagne flutes, stumbled over the edge of a thick Persian rug. "Watch out," Silvia gasped, stepping forward. It was too late. The tray tipped, and a dozen crystal flutes shattered violently against the marble, spraying sparkling wine across the floor. The sharp, explosive sound brought a momentary hush to the immediate vicinity. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry," the waitress stammered, instantly dropping to her knees. Her hands shook violently as she began gathering the jagged shards of glass, indifferent to the sharp edges slicing into her skin. Silvia, acting on an instinct she didn't know she possessed, knelt beside her. "Don't touch that. You'll cut yourself." "Let the cleaning staff." The waitress looked up. The breath vanished from Silvia's lungs. It was as if the universe had violently fractured, placing a mirror in the middle of the corridor. The girl kneeling before her possessed the exact same almond-shaped hazel eyes. She had the exact same sharp, aristocratic cheekbones, the same slight, elegant widow's peak at her hairline, and the very same delicate curvature of the jaw. The only difference was their circumstances. Where Silvia wore diamonds and silk, the stranger wore a stained, cheap white catering uniform. Where Silvia's skin was pampered, the stranger looked exhausted, shadows bruising the skin under her eyes. "Who?" Silvia whispered, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" The waitress blinked, equally paralyzed. The fear in her eyes morphed into profound confusion as she took in Silvia's face. My name is Elena Rossi." A heavy hand suddenly clamped onto Silvia's shoulder. It was Marco, one of her father's most ruthless bodyguards. "Miss Orlando, step away. The help can clean this up." "No," Silvia said, her voice suddenly finding a core of steel. She stood up, reaching down to grab Elena's wrist, pulling the terrified waitress to her feet. "She's coming with me." Marco frowned, his hand drifting toward the bulge beneath his tailored jacket. "Miss, your father wouldn't." "Take us to my father," Silvia commanded, her hazel eyes blazing with a fire that Marco recognized all too well. It was the Dawn's fire. Right now, the drive back to the Orlando estate was suffocatingly silent. Elena sat in the corner of the leather-upholstered SUV, clutching her bleeding hands, trembling like a trapped sparrow. Silvia couldn't stop staring at her. It defied all logic. It defied reality. When they arrived at the sprawling, fortified mansion, Silvia dragged Elena past the bewildered guards and straight toward Filippo Orlando's private study. She didn't knock. She threw the heavy oak doors open. Filippo sat behind a massive desk, shrouded in the blue smoke of a Cuban cigar. At 65, he was a man carved from granite, his face lined with the cruel mathematics of a lifetime in the mob. He looked up, his eyes narrowing in irritation at the intrusion. "Silvia, what is the meaning of—" He stopped. The cigar slipped from his fingers, tumbling onto the polished wood, scattering red-hot ash. Silvia pushed Elena forward into the light of the desk lamp. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. "Dad," Silvia said, her voice cracking under the weight of the impossible. "Dad, look at her. She looks exactly like me. Who is she?" Filippo Orlando, the man who had never blinked in the face of federal indictments or rival guns, went entirely pale. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the invincible Mafia Don shattered, revealing a man looking at a ghost. Filippo's heart hammered against his ribs like a desperate prisoner. He stared at the girl in the cheap catering uniform, the hazel eyes, the chin, the hair. It was a flawless, terrifying replication of the daughter he had raised. But it wasn't just Silvia he saw. He saw the ghosts of 1,999. He saw the fire. He forced his lungs to draw breath, relying on decades of trained sociopathy to rebuild his mask of stone. He slowly picked up his fallen cigar and crushed it into a heavy crystal ashtray. "A doppelganger," Filippo said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that betrayed none of his internal panic. "An astonishing coincidence. The world is full of them, Silvia." "A coincidence?" Silvia stepped closer, slamming her palms on his desk. "Look at her. This isn't just a passing resemblance. We could be identical twins. Did Mom have another child? Did you keep this from me? Your mother died giving birth to you, Silvia. You know this." Filippo lied smoothly, though the words tasted like ash. He turned his cold gaze to Elena, who was shaking violently. "What did you say your name was, girl?" "Elena," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Elena Rossi, sir. I didn't mean any trouble. I dropped the tray, and she brought me here. Please, I just want to go home." Filippo hit an intercom button on his desk. "Marco, get in here." The door opened instantly. "Boss, take Miss Rossi back to her home, pay her $1,000 for her trouble and the fright my daughter has put her through, and ensure she arrives safely." Silvia spun around. "You can't just send her away. We need to run a DNA test. We need to know." "Enough," Filippo roared, slamming his fist on the desk. The sheer violence of the sound made both girls flinch. "You are in Orlando. You do not drag strangers off the street into our sanctuary because of a parlor trick of genetics. This conversation is over, Silvia. Go to your room." Tears of frustration welled in Silvia's eyes. She looked at Elena, giving her a helpless, desperate glance before storming out of the study. Marco gently but firmly escorted the bewildered Elena out, closing the heavy doors behind them. Alone in the dim light, Filippo slumped back into his leather chair. The silence pressed against his eardrums. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, his hand trembling slightly as he bypassed the loaded .45 caliber pistol and reached for a false bottom. He pulled out a faded, yellowed photograph. It was a picture of a man and a woman holding two identical baby girls. The man in the photo was not Filippo. It was Antonio Moretti, the head of the rival family Filippo had slaughtered 25 years ago. "God forgive me," Filippo whispered to the empty room. He picked up a burner phone from his desk and dialed a number he rarely used. It was answered on the first ring. "Vance," Filippo said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "I have a job. A girl named Elena Rossi. She's currently working catering at the Belvedere Hotel. I want to know everything. Where she grew up, who raised her, what hospitals she's been in. I want her entire life stripped bare and put on my desk by tomorrow morning." "And Vance?" "Yeah, boss?" The raspy voice on the other end replied, "If anyone else looks into her, you put a bullet in their eye." Across town, Elena Rossi was dropped off in the pouring rain in front of a dilapidated apartment complex in the Narrows, a neighborhood forgotten by the city's wealth. She clutched the envelope of cash Marco had shoved into her hands. As she climbed the rotting wooden stairs to her cramped apartment, her mind raced. She had grown up in the foster system, bounced from one abusive home to another, told she was abandoned at a fire station with nothing but a blanket. She had spent her whole life feeling like a fragment of a person, an incomplete sentence. But looking into Silvia Orlando's eyes tonight, Elena felt something she had never experienced. She felt a terrifying, undeniable gravity, the undeniable pull of blood. Arthur Vance was a man who lived in the shadows of Chicago's underbelly. A disgraced former detective, he was now Filippo Orlando's most efficient bloodhound. By 6 a.m. the following morning, he was sitting across from Filippo in the Don's study, sipping black coffee. Between them lay a thick manila folder. "It wasn't easy to track, boss, but money talks," Vance said, his voice rough like sandpaper. "Elena Rossi, born the 14th of October 1999, the exact same day as your daughter, Silvia." Filippo stared at the folder, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. "Keep going. The records are a mess, purposely scrubbed. But I found a retired nurse, living down in Boca Raton. She was working at St. Jude's Hospital, the night of the incident, the night the Moretti estate burned to the ground." Filippo closed his eyes. The memories crashed over him. The smell of gasoline, the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire. Antonio Moretti bleeding out on the marble floor. Filippo had ordered the hit to secure his empire. But when he walked through the smoldering ruins, he found a nursery, and in it, a single crying infant. His wife, Caterina, had been barren, spiraling into a deep depression. In a twisted moment of guilt and hubris, Filippo took the child. He presented the baby to Caterina, claiming it was an orphan from a civilian casualty, knowing full well it was the heir to his greatest enemy. They named her Silvia. "What did the nurse say?" Filippo asked, his voice a dangerous whisper. "She said a panicked maid from the Moretti household brought in a second baby that night," Vance replied, tapping a document. "Identical twins." The maid knew the Orlando syndicate was coming. She split the girls up, hoping at least one would survive. "You took the one left in the house." The maid dropped the second one at St. Jude's and vanished. The hospital quietly transferred the child to a state orphanage under the name Jane Doe to protect her from the mob war. She eventually became Elena Rossi in the system. Filippo rubbed his face. His empire, his legacy, was built on a foundation of lies. Silvia was not his blood. She was a Moretti. And now, the second Moretti heir had walked right through his front door. In the Mafia, bloodlines were everything. If the other families, or his own capos, discovered he had raised the child of their sworn enemy and that another survived, it would be seen as an unforgivable weakness. It would spark a civil war. "Who else knows about this?" Filippo demanded. "Just me, boss. And the nurse." Vance paused, his eyes narrowing. "But there's a complication. While I was pulling the files from the county clerk, I noticed I wasn't the only one sniffing around the Rossi name." "Who?" "One of Matteo Vitiello's guys." They pulled her address. Filippo's blood ran cold. Matteo Vitiello was his underboss, a younger, hyper-violent, incredibly ambitious man who had been chafing under Filippo's recent attempts to legitimize the family business. Matteo wanted the old days of extortion and street wars. If Matteo had noticed the girl at the gala, if Matteo discovered the truth, Vance, Filippo stood up, his presence suddenly terrifying. "Gather the loyalists. We need to secure the girl. Today." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in a dimly lit, smoke-filled basement of a meatpacking plant, Matteo Vitiello threw a series of photographs onto a metal table. His lieutenants leaned in. The photos, taken secretly at the gala, showed Silvia and Elena standing side by side. Matteo, sharp-featured and wearing a bespoke suit, smiled. It was a cruel reptilian expression. "Look at this." The old man told us his wife had Silvia while on vacation in Sicily. But my guys just dug up the truth. Silvia isn't an Orlando. She's a Moretti, and there's a spare. A murmur of shock rippled through the mobsters. "Filippo has gone soft," Matteo declared, pacing the floor. "He raised the rat spawn of our enemies. He lied to us, to the commission. He is illegitimate, and his time is over. We take the waitress today. We use her to draw Filippo out, and we end the Orlando reign tonight." Silvia could not sleep. The image of Elena's face, her face was burned into the back of her eyelids. She had spent the morning digging through her father's locked filing cabinets while he was in meetings, a desperate attempt to find any shred of truth. She found nothing but shipping manifests and political bribes. But she remembered the address she had seen on the envelope of cash Marco had given Elena, the Narrows. Dressing down in jeans and a simple jacket, Silvia slipped out the back entrance of the estate, bribing a junior driver to take her across town without logging the trip. She had to know. Elena's apartment building was a decaying brick structure that smelled of stale cigarettes and damp rot. Silvia climbed the stairs, feeling entirely out of place, her heart pounding. She knocked on door 4B. After a long pause, the door cracked open, secured by a heavy chain. Elena peered out, her eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't be here. Please," Silvia whispered. "I need to talk to you. I need to understand." Elena hesitated, then unlatched the chain. The apartment was tiny, sparsely furnished, but impeccably clean. A stack of overdue medical bills sat on a small kitchen table. For a long moment, the two young women just stood in the center of the room, staring at each other. The mirror effect was still staggering. "My whole life," Elena started, wrapping her arms around herself. "I felt like I was missing a piece of my soul. I was bounced around foster homes. I was told I was nobody. And then I see you, living like a queen, covered in diamonds." There was no anger in her voice, only a profound, exhausting sadness. "I didn't know," Silvia pleaded, stepping forward. "I swear to you, I didn't know. My father. He told me my mother died when I was born. He never mentioned a sister. He never mentioned a twin." "Is he your father?" Elena asked quietly. "Because if we are twins, and I was abandoned, did he throw me away?" The question hit Silvia like a physical blow. The moral injustice of it all rushed into her mind. If Filippo Orlando was their biological father, he had kept one daughter in luxury and condemned the other to a life of poverty and struggle. Why? Because she was a girl? Because of some twisted mafia superstition? "I don't know," Silvia admitted, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. "But I'm going to find out. I'm not leaving you here, Elena. You're my sister. You're my blood. I'll protect you." Before Elena could respond, the front door of the apartment violently exploded inward, the deadbolt tearing out of the wood frame. Silvia screamed as three men in tactical gear poured into the tiny room. They moved with terrifying precision. One man backhanded Silvia across the face, sending her crashing into the kitchen table. The world spun in a blur of pain and stars. Through the ringing in her ears, she saw the other two men grab Elena. Elena fought fiercely, kicking and scratching, but she was no match for the armed thugs. "Let her go," Silvia shrieked, scrambling for a kitchen knife. A heavy boot stepped on her wrist, pinning it to the linoleum. She looked up into the grinning face of Matteo Vitiello. "Hello, little bird," Matteo sneered, crouching down. "Or should I say, little Moretti?" "What are you doing, Matteo? My father will kill you for this," Silvia spat, tasting blood in her mouth. "Your father?" Matteo laughed, signaling his men to drag the thrashing Elena out the door. "Your father is a fraud, and tonight, he pays for his sins. Tell the Don that if he wants his real legacy back, he meets me at the old shipyard at midnight. Come alone." Matteo kicked her in the ribs for good measure, leaving Silvia gasping for air on the floor as they dragged her sister away. Silvia burst into Filippo's study, her face bruised, her clothes torn. The senior capos who were gathered around the desk stopped mid-sentence. Filippo took one look at his daughter, and the blood drained from his face. "Out," Filippo commanded the room. "Everyone out." Now, when the heavy doors clicked shut, Filippo rushed to Silvia, his hands trembling as he checked her bruised face. "Who did this? Who touched you?" "Matteo," Silvia sobbed, pushing his hands away. "Matteo Vitiello. He broke into Elena's apartment. He took her, Dad. He took my sister." Filippo closed his eyes, a look of profound agony crossing his aged features. The nightmare had arrived. "He called me a Moretti," Silvia said, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper. She looked at the man she had called father for 25 years, the man who had bought her ponies, wiped her tears, and shielded her from the dark reality of his world. What did he mean, Dad? Who am I? Filippo walked behind his desk. He looked older than he ever had. The weight of his sins, collected over decades, finally broke his posture. He slumped into his chair. 25 years ago, Filippo began, his voice hollow. The city was bleeding. The Moretti family was our biggest rival. It was kill or be killed. I ordered a strike on their estate. We wiped them out. But when I walked through the house, I found you in a crib. Silvia stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Your mother. My Caterina. She couldn't have children. She was heartbroken. When I saw you, I didn't see an enemy. I saw a chance to give my wife a child, to give myself a daughter. I took you. I raised you as my own. You murdered my real parents, Silvia said, the words tasting like acid. The moral horror of her existence hit her with the force of a freight train. Every dress, every meal, every privilege she had enjoyed was paid for by the blood of her biological family. I did, Filippo confessed, looking her directly in the eyes, accepting her hatred. I am a monster, Silvia. I have never claimed otherwise, but the love I have for you, that was the only pure thing in my entire life. I didn't know there was a twin. I swear on my soul, I didn't know. If I had, I would have taken her too. You don't have a soul, Silvia spat, backing away from him. You built a life on a lie, and now my sister is going to die because of your sins. Filippo stood up, opening the hidden drawer. He took out the heavy .45 caliber pistol and checked the magazine. The sound of the slide racking echoed loudly in the quiet room. My sins are my own, Filippo said, his voice hardening into the ruthless cadence of the mob boss he was. But Matteo will not take another daughter from me. He said the shipyard at midnight. He told you to come alone, Silvia said, her anger warring with her terror. A dawn never goes alone, Filippo said. He looked at Silvia, his eyes burning with a fierce, tragic light. I know you hate me. You have every right. But right now, you need to trust me. We are going to get your sister back. And then, I will give you the truth you deserve. Filippo made one phone call. Vance, it's time. We clean house tonight. The abandoned shipyard was a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and dilapidated warehouses. A freezing rain had begun to fall, slicking the concrete and masking the sound of footsteps. Inside Warehouse 7, Elena was tied to a metal chair beneath a single harsh halogen bulb. Matteo paced in front of her, smoking a cigarette, surrounded by a dozen heavily armed men. He won't come, Matteo sneered, checking his watch. He's a coward. He'll cut his losses. You don't know him, a voice echoed through the cavernous space. Matteo spun around, his gun raised. Standing in the massive doorway of the warehouse, silhouetted by the lightning flashing outside, was Filippo Orlando. He was alone. He wore a dark overcoat, his hands resting casually at his sides. Filippo, Matteo smiled, though his eyes darted around the shadows. You actually came, and without your army. How pathetic. Let the girl go, Matteo, Filippo said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the sound of the rain. This is between you and me. You want the throne? Take it. But the girl leaves. It's not just about the throne, old man, Matteo spat. It's about respect. You made us bow to a Moretti. You poisoned our bloodline. They both have to die. And then you. Matteo raised his weapon, aiming directly at Elena's head. Now, Filippo roared. The darkness of the warehouse suddenly exploded. Arthur Vance and a dozen of Filippo's most loyal enforcers, who had silently infiltrated the rafters and the shadows, opened fire. The sound was deafening. Gunfire lit up the warehouse like a strobe light. Matteo's men, caught completely off guard, scrambled for cover, but they were cut down with ruthless efficiency. Filippo didn't dive for cover. He drew his .45 and walked straight into the chaos, his eyes fixed entirely on Elena. Bullets sparked off the metal containers around him, concrete spraying into the air. He shot two of Matteo's men who tried to flank him. his aim as steady as it was 20 years ago. Matteo, realizing his coup was failing, grabbed Elena by the hair, hauling her up and pressing his gun to her temple to use her as a human shield. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" Filippo yelled, raising his free hand. His men immediately stopped shooting. The sudden silence was filled only with the groans of the wounded and the patter of the rain. Matteo was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, his eyes wide with manic desperation. "Drop the gun, Filippo. Drop it, or I paint the floor with her brains." From the shadows behind Matteo, a figure quietly emerged. It was Silvia. She had disobeyed her father's orders to stay in the armored car. She had crept through the back entrance, armed with a small revolver she had taken from the estate's armory. Her hands shook violently. She had never fired a gun in her life. Filippo saw her over Matteo's shoulder. His eyes widened slightly. He had to distract Matteo. "You're right, Matteo," Filippo said loudly, dropping his heavy pistol to the concrete. He held his hands up. "I corrupted the family. I sought redemption where I had no right to find it. I am the rot in this organization." Matteo laughed, a manic, breathless sound. Finally, the great Don admits. "Silvia, now!" Filippo shouted. Matteo flinched, beginning to turn. Silvia closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. The bullet missed Matteo entirely, ricocheting off a metal beam, but the distraction was enough. Elena bit down hard on Matteo's hand, causing him to scream and loosen his grip. In that fraction of a second, Filippo lunged forward. He didn't go for his gun. He threw his body between Matteo and Elena, just as Matteo wildly fired. Two loud cracks echoed. Filippo slammed into Matteo, driving him to the ground. Arthur Vance stepped out of the shadows and put a single, final bullet into Matteo's head. The warehouse fell dead silent. Silvia dropped the gun and ran forward, screaming. Elena scrambled away from Matteo's lifeless body, sobbing hysterically. Filippo lay on his back on the cold concrete. A dark, spreading stain ruined the front of his pristine white shirt. He had taken both bullets point blank to the chest. "Dad! Dad, no!" Silvia collapsed beside him, pressing her hands desperately against his chest to stop the bleeding. The blood, her enemy's blood, her father's blood, was warm and sticky. Elena crawled over, equally horrified, kneeling beside the man who had destroyed her family, but who had just given his life to save hers. Filippo looked up at the two girls. His vision was blurring, the edges of the world turning dark. He reached up with a trembling, blood-stained hand and touched Silvia's cheek, then moved it to touch Elena's. "Two of you," Filippo whispered, a bloody smile touching his lips. "The universe demands balance. I took a life. I give a life. Stay with me, please. Vance, call an ambulance," Silvia screamed, tears raining down onto Filippo's face. "No." Filippo coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "It's done. My empire. It dies tonight. Let it burn, Silvia. Take the legitimate money. Take care of your sister. Be better than me." Filippo Orlando's eyes lost their focus, staring up into the dark rafters. The chest stopped rising. The ruthless Mafia boss, the man who had authored so much tragedy, was gone, paying his final debt to the universe. 6 months later, the morning sun cast a bright, golden glow over the newly inaugurated Caterina Foundation for Disadvantaged Youth. The building, entirely funded by the liquidated, legitimate assets of the dismantled Orlando syndicate, stood as a beacon of hope in the very neighborhood where Elena had suffered. Silvia and Elena stood side by side in the courtyard. They no longer looked like polar opposites. They both wore elegant, understated business suits. The brutal trauma of the past had forged a profound, unbreakable bond between them. After Filippo's death, the Orlando crime family collapsed. Without Filippo or Matteo, the capos fractured, quickly rounded up by the FBI using the evidence Arthur Vance honoring Filippo's final, secret order had anonymously mailed to the district attorney. The reign of terror was over. Silvia had inherited a fortune, and she had immediately split it down the middle with Elena. But neither sister wanted the blood money for themselves. They dedicated their lives to tearing down the corrupted legacy of their fathers, both Moretti and Orlando, and building something pure. "Are you ready?" Elena asked, reaching out to hold Silvia's hand. Silvia looked at her identical twin. She still saw the ghosts of the past, the moral injustice that had separated them, the blood that had been spilled. But she also saw the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Filippo was a monster who had done a single, ultimate good deed. He had allowed the cycle of violence to break. "I'm ready," Silvia smiled, squeezing her sister's hand. Together, the twins walked up to the podium, facing the crowd of reporters and city officials, stepping out of the shadows of the Mafia and into the light of their own forged destiny. The mirror was no longer fractured. It was whole.